And now it's my great pleasure in Tasu's absence to lead us on to this next panel around teachers at the centre of equitable learning, which has been sort of one of the thematic areas that has been really important for Real Centre research, and to introduce our partners from various different aspects of our work on the panel here today. So I'm going to do brief introductions. As before, I'm not going to say everything there is to know about them. Do look at the bios online if you would like to read more. But to start with, our dear colleague here in the Real Centre, Dr. Dawit Tibebu, who is one of the planning group that I mentioned earlier, and is Senior Research Associate here in the Real Centre, and has been for around 6 years, I think, now. He's been working both on the RISE Ethiopia programme that we heard from Tasu earlier, as well as work that we've done in collaboration with Lydie, Shima and others on a programme on leaders in teaching in Rwanda, funded by the MasterCard Foundation. So Lydie, sitting next to Dawit there, is a senior programme associate with Laterite, who do amazing evidence policy work in a number of countries, particularly across countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And we're currently partnering with them on the FCDO Learning and Inclusion for Transformation LIFT programme, again an acronym that somebody spent some time coming up with, in Rwanda. So we're looking forward to that continued journey together. Baela Jamil just has so many hats that I wouldn't know where to start, so I'm not going to try and say everything, I'm afraid, Baela. I'm sure that actually you're so well known here. You're a friend and colleague for many, many years. But importantly, Baela was actually a friend and colleague of the Real Centre before the Real Centre even existed. And you posted a lovely post on LinkedIn about a time when you were here together with Dr. Manaz Aslam presenting about the ASA Pakistan data. And that really did inform some of that early work we've done in the Real Centre, and some of the work that I think, Julia, you were mentioning with the PAL network, looking at learning inequalities in the early years. And then finally, Rona Bronwin, who is one of our many colleagues at FCDO who have supported and engaged with our work over the years. Rona was a key colleague for the RISE Ethiopia programme for many years, and is now FCDO's Foundational Learning Policy Lead. So as you can see, we've got colleagues here who have huge experience on the topic that we're going to discuss. And I just have one very simple question for them. Can you share your reflections on putting teachers at the centre of equitable learning? And you can all answer that in whatever way you wish. So I'm a strict timekeeper, as people know. They've got about 7 minutes each, which is a huge topic to say in 7 minutes. So over to you, Dawit.
Thank you, Pauline, for the opportunity to reflect on this important question. And I'm also very pleased that we are starting today's series of panel discussions with teachers at the top of the agenda. I think this shows our recognition of the wonderful job teachers are doing globally, and particularly teachers in disadvantaged and in conflict-affected settings. So I would like to thank the organizers for putting teachers on the top of the list. My reflection is going to be based on my experience as a researcher at the RISE Ethiopia program, which has been, as Tasu said nicely, which has been a collaborative project between the Real Centre and Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia. One of the key achievements, Pauline, is the broader and explicit focus on equity at the policy level over the past decade in Ethiopia. There has been a growing recognition, a growing understanding among policymakers that equity needs to be, or equity should be, a policy priority if teachers are to play a meaningful role in supporting equitable learning in the classroom. And this commitment to equity has been reflected in several initiatives over the past decade, of course with some technical and financial support from donor partners. Initiatives, for example, the establishment of inclusive education resource centers, where children with disabilities could get access to relevant learning materials, where teachers could get some specialized pedagogical trainings. This has been one important achievement. The establishment of girls' clubs, mainly in rural parts of Ethiopia, in historically disadvantaged regions, where girls could freely speak on issues that matter to them. the expansion of pre-primary education. When we started the Rise Ethiopia project about 6-7 years ago, there were only a few schools, mainly in urban areas, that focused on or that gave 1 year of pre-primary education. Recently, pre-primary education in Ethiopia has been expanded in many parts of, in many public schools across Ethiopia, and particularly in historically disadvantaged areas. And I think this is a positive progress towards greater equity. And another encouraging achievement over the past decade has been the government's effort to strengthen and expand both the pre-service and in-service teacher education programs in Ethiopia. We have this specialized teacher training programs which never existed 10 years ago. We have, it's common now to hear or to see teacher training programs on disability responsive pedagogy, gender responsive pedagogy, learner-centered pedagogy, training on teachers on continuous classroom assessment, where teachers could easily identify the learning levels of their students to adapt their instruction. So there has been some progress. And one of the findings of the Rise Ethiopia project is when teachers are sufficiently supported, when teachers are engaged in meaningful school-based teacher professional development programs, they were effective in improving the learning outcomes of their students. They were very effective, particularly in improving the learning outcomes of children with disadvantaged backgrounds, girls, children with disabilities, children from rural parts of Ethiopia, children with lower initial learning levels. So one of our conclusions has been, if we provide the required support for teachers, they have been very effective in improving the learning outcomes of children, particularly from marginalized groups. So these are some of the key achievements. And of course, I'm not saying that everything has been successfully implemented. It's still a work in progress. But I can tell you that what we understood from our Rise Ethiopia research is there has been some encouraging positive progress. In terms of the key challenges, as you can imagine, there are quite a few, but I will mention some of them. One challenge is teachers are still working in severely under-resourced schools. Schools simply don't have the basic resources. I'm talking about the basic resources. They don't have the basic resources to address the diverse needs of their students in the classroom. And I'm not going to discuss in detail those list of resource challenges being experienced by teachers, but I can give you one quick fact. The per student spending in Ethiopia is among the lowest in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not even comparing Ethiopia with middle income or high income countries. It's the lowest if we compare it with sub-Saharan average in terms of per student spending. Another challenge is there has been limited focus on teachers' mental well-being in teacher professional development programs. There has been a heavy emphasis on content knowledge and pedagogical skills, which are important, but in my opinion, teachers' mental well-being hasn't been prioritized in current teacher professional development programs. Another challenge is related to how teacher professional development programs have been designed in Ethiopia and broadly in sub-Saharan Africa. What we have identified in our research is there is very little recognition to teachers' lived experiences, to teachers' instructional needs, to the local context when those teacher professional development programs are designed. What we understood from our research is that most of these teacher professional development programs are designed with a deficit lens that teachers are the cause of the learning crisis. There is a tendency to equate the learning crisis being experienced in Ethiopia and in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa with a teaching crisis. And in my opinion, that is a serious misdiagnosis. Teachers are trying their best. If we provide the required support, teachers are achieving. Teachers are really making change in terms of improving the learning outcomes. So, and unfortunately, this misdiagnosis of the learning crisis has led to this wave of generic, simplistic, top-down and contextually less relevant teacher professional development programs. We have these programs like structured pedagogy, teaching at the right level. I mean, you name it. I'm not against structured pedagogy or teaching at the right level, but my point is when those teacher professional development programs are designed, teachers' voices are not included, teachers are not part of the co-designing process. we're just imposing those centrally designed, top-down teacher professional development programs. And most of the teachers that we spoke to during our RISE Ethiopia research, they told us that they're feeling overwhelmed. They're experiencing intervention fatigue. Teachers are telling us that they lack the agency. So I think if teacher professional development programs have to be impactful and sustainable, we need to make sure that teachers' voices are included in the design process. We need to view teachers as collaborative and active agents in the design process, not passive recipients of centrally designed teacher professional development programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Some excellent points to set the scene, and I'll hand over to Lydie.
Thank you. Thanks for the reflection, and I will be building on what Dawit mentioned in terms of teachers' voices in equitable learning. Too often, we see that education research stops short of engaging those at the front lines, the teachers themselves. So for the past 5 years, Laterite and the Real Center have been the learning partners for the Massacred Foundation's Leaders in Teaching initiative that aims to improve teaching quality and student learning outcomes in Rwandan secondary schools. So as the learning partners, we made a deliberate decision to go back to the teachers to share the research findings with them. And this was for them to engage with, interpret, but also share some recommendations from what we had, like from the findings from the research. And we call these teacher voices, as we wanted their voices to be central to our findings, but also to have an opportunity to put together some, to have that participatory process that treated the teachers more as knowledge holders, not just respondents, as part of the research we've conducted. So in terms of approach, we have organized teacher dissemination workshops in 2022 and 2024, reaching over 300 teachers and school leaders who had taken part in the research. And we did present findings aligned with inequities in student learning outcomes, gender disparities among teachers and school leaders, but also features of effective teaching practices and professional development. During these workshops, we asked teachers to reflect on the findings, identify the causes, but also share some policy recommendations that we did in turn put into a policy brief and shared with the program partners and policymakers, including the Minister of Education, in dedicated policy events in 2022 and 2024. So for us, this process was very important because teachers are often left out of the evidence to policy process, despite being the best place to contextualize the findings from our research. I would like to highlight a few achievements from this process. Throughout this process, teachers were positioned as interpreters of findings or evidence. So teachers, they were not just research subjects, but they were also active interpreters of the findings that directly concerned their practice and their children, the students as well. So this shifted the dynamics from top-down to participatory, empowering the teachers to contribute insights grounded in their lived experience, which was very important. So the teachers' reflection have shaped national discussions during the policy events around gender equity, CPD reform, infrastructure improvements, and curriculum streamlining. So for example, the call for gender-responsive CPD and mentorship for female STEM teachers was taken up by policymakers and implementing partners during the policy events. As we conducted research over a long period, following the same teachers over 5 years, this process deepened teacher trust in the research processes as they asked to be involved in subsequent data collection activities and in dissemination events. So this engagement fosters a culture where evidence is not imposed to people, but co-owned, which is critical for uptake and sustainability. Finally, so this Teacher Voices initiative offered a model for how to bridge the policy or the research to policy gap by engaging educators directly. So this is rare in education, so mainly in low and middle income countries, for teachers to be consulted after the research has been conducted. So this model has changed that. There are a couple of ongoing challenges that I wanted to highlight. So while there is limited formal mechanism for integrating teacher feedback, while the two policy events that we had created a window for influence, formal ongoing channels for incorporating feedback from teachers into national policies are still lacking, as Dawit was mentioning as well. So there is a risk that the teacher voices are heard in discrete events and not systematically embedded in decision-making processes. Sustainability requires also continued investment. So the success of the teacher voices was dependent on dedicated funding from the ESRC and the Massacre Foundation for the second one, and committed facilitation. Without institutionalizing these participatory processes, there is a danger that the teacher voices become episodic, so not embedded. So to close this, if we want to teachers to be agents of equitable learning, we must also treat them as agents of educational knowledge. So this process with the teacher voices has taught us that when we bring findings back to the teachers, we not only receive feedback, we get much more. So we get grounded insights from the teachers, practical solution, and shared ownership of what needs to change. Throughout this process, the teachers had helped us close the gap between research and practice. They didn't just confirm the data that we showed, but they also explained why those patterns exist as they are closer to the context, and how policy can then respond from the recommendation they shared that then we brought to the policymakers and program partners. However, this kind of engagement shouldn't be a one-off. For real change, teacher voices must be institutionalized, and not only as an act of consultation, but as a commitment to shared decision-making. And we see that equity is not only just about learners. It also means equity in voice, in agency, as Dawit mentioned, and influence for teachers. So when teachers are included, equity is not just an aspiration, it becomes actionable. So I wanted to close with a quote from the chief technical advisor within the Ministry of Education in Rwanda that he shared during our last policy event. He said that our teachers are more than just educators. They are the cornerstone of our education system. They have a deep understanding of the realities within our classrooms. It is therefore essential that we listen to their voices and allow their experiences and insights to guide our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lydie, and I think that will move nicely on to Baela.
Thank you very much, and congratulations again to the Real Center. It's multiple leaders and the awesome work that they've done on a very important area of work that has informed many countries and also the work globally and nationally. So I just wanted to begin with sort of a bit of context. I head Idara-e-Taleem-o-Aagahi, or the Center for Education Consciousness. We are celebrating 25 years of the organization. And just to be reminded that when we were formed, it was at the call of the government. I returned from Sindh to Lahore, to Punjab, and they said, we have too many failing schools, what can you do? And that was the provocation for the organization. And that meant that if you had to go to a failing school, which by the way was a story of a decade-long failed large-scale reform of government and donors together, the Social Action Plan 1 and 2 with falling enrollments, children leaving government schools, going towards almost 33 or 35% children in private school. It was a huge wake-up call. So the only way to go to a school like that was to have a notion of what failure looked like and what would success look like. So evidence had to be there, voices had to be there, of teachers, of head teachers, of parents, of children, and so on. And that became really a kind of a laboratory for us to be able to see what happens in public sector systems, since 97% of our work is in public sector. And so when that happened and we started looking at innovations, we thought this was a great way to be able to inform the government of what was happening inside the public sector system and what were the challenges and how to address those at the system level. I just wanted to share with you that whole idea that when you have that kind of a crisis, then it has to be a whole system reform, a whole school reform, and to be able to look at where is that social capital on which you will build, innovations, and through innovations inform the government that these do work. And that was a very exciting time for us because it meant that we were evidence-based, that we had to look at things in minutiae, that we had to look at children, parents, all of them together as a community of practice. That whole aspect of nurturing meant the smallest amount of relief, which means within 4 months of our coming into existence, we created what was called a normal summer school program, but it was called Summer School, A Journey of Happiness. And their words were well chosen because we wanted to see how teachers could begin to feel from being an utter failure, because as catalysts of any action, they were being, just as has been mentioned, low trust for teachers, labeled as failures, and to say what a waste, because that is the largest workforce any country has, so much money going into them, almost 90% of the recurrent budgets, and nothing to show. But when the summer school came, then they started doing public, what is called project-based learning, doing creative work, and everybody was happy at the end to showcase what they had done. It meant that they were positive practices. Right there and then, we saw a huge restoration of confidence in the government that something we are not doing right and we need to do right. And I think that aspect of work and innovations in all the work that has since then started, and thank you to Julia for acknowledging the People's Action for Learning Network, we realized as an organization that to be able to do work with teachers and quality, it meant that we had to do things together in alliances. And alliances within the country and alliances beyond at the South-South level. The PAL network was something that we created, we the people created. And it's very good to know that the data that we were generating, whilst it was being shunned aside, not owned by the government, but today the UN Statistical Commission says the citizen data is what is going to count and going to populate SDGs 2030. Well, a lot of that also comes from teacher. But I think what is important is to be able to see the binaries. Remember, we are still, many of us, in a colonial system, in the same industrial model of education, where there are binaries constantly. The binaries between academic and non-academic, and I'm very happy to see Bronwin here, that the whole notion of looking at education and learning as emotional, as social, as well as academic was very important to see. Look at those 27 domains and to say that this cannot be. A teacher would ask me in those failed systems, ma'am, if I talk about how you are, the principal will come or the inspector will come and say, why are you asking the child an unnecessary question? Finish the syllabus. Okay? So to be able to talk, to be human, to find the humanism within teachers was in itself was like a mini revolution to begin with. Now it's sort of become the norm. But again, to put the context, 3 million teachers almost in Pakistan, including private sector, 1 million teacher shortage. So when you're talking about teachers, you're talking about the deficit mentality, you're talking about, they are the ones responsible, you're talking about resource constraint context, and you're then talking about what teachers can say and what they cannot. I had to negotiate in a school where the Taliban had schools that became recruiting grounds in Swat for suicide bombers, And those suicide bombers were little children, actually, adolescents. And when we were restoring the schools, all we were asking was, can we have a double period? And say, ma'am, can you get a notification? Because if the notifications are not there. And I'm just sharing that, how tough it is for teachers to be able to negotiate quality and discussion. Rafiullah Kakar is sitting here. He was responsible for creating the District Education Performance Index in Pakistan, in which the quality and the learning had, of course, teacher performance as well. And of course, everything looked very abysmal, especially when you have provinces where you have almost out of 90% schools as primary and 85% of those as 1 and 2 teacher schools. You can't even begin to talk about innovations and change. But where you do, you need to take into account how do you turn this aside. And I want to say it means that you're humanizing equity as a human journey. Today is Child Labor Day, and much of our work was in areas of worst forms of child labor, and it was called Life Skills for Kids. And for 8 years, we took out the worst forms of children from as rat pickers to now who are now running successful businesses and completed. Why? It's the teachers who make that difference. Now, that means that if you humanize equity as human journeys, if you create that courage to confront evidence, so you're looking even at the TAL work, and it's large scale now in Pakistan, you're looking at a process of teaching at the right level where the teacher is becoming the evidence gatherer at different times, as the pedagogue who knows how to engage, to remove, to let the children have agency and to let her have her or his own agency, and to be able to measure yet again, to then become confident about that I have been enabled as a teacher, not just with knowledge and attitudes and skills, but also how to measure that and how to be able to become confident that this is how it happens. And engaging with diverse students and very, very diverse students with many challenges at the intersection of not just poverty, hunger, coming hungry to classrooms, but also at climate change challenges and much more. But then, trying to produce books. In this period, what we did was also to try and create teachers' prizes. We created a book which was about teachers' voices, 100 teachers' stories, where teachers were healers, counselors, therapists, friends, mentors, and co-creators. And these were, how do you remember empowered teachers? How do you bring them to the center of the dialogue? How do you humanize them? And especially humanize them where they can be enabled and they can actually. And so, even in the USSR data, it was not just collecting the evidence saying things are very bad, just be able to share with teacher unions and associations, taking that data back to the classroom, back to the school, back to the village, back to the community, and back to teachers. This is the data we collected, this is the tool, this is what it looks like, what will you do? It is that kind of equity building that we teachers said, we are going to sit and do it. Many exciting initiatives in the public sector, including Teachers Without Frontiers, which was all about technology. And teachers in distant districts, we wanted to test. If you take 100 teachers in distant districts, enable them with a tablet, give them the whole notion of what neuroscience looks like. Because today, learning is with your head, heart, and gut. That's how distributed it is. And so when somebody comes and says, only the syllabus, you say, sorry, I listen until I can make a child feel comfortable and happy. I cannot begin the learning process. So I think that's the kind of magic that we need and we were doing. What I wanted to end with really was whether it was our program of Teachers Without Frontiers or Siani Sahelia, the Accelerated Action for Adolescent Girls, which Real Center and Monazai sitting, Janila all had something to do with in terms of the evaluations, etc., or the interactive libraries in government schools. Most of our work sits in the government schools. What happens? So Baela Jamil, who wears many hats, is also working with the government, sometimes as a technical advisor, sometimes as a designer for the roadmap of a 5-year multi-sectoral program, sometimes, as someone who's critiquing, but someone who's always egging the government to look at what has worked inside their spaces with human beings, and to be able to look at that middle tier and the learning teams, because I also wear the hat of the champion of the Learning Generation Initiative, that learning teams matter, and middle tier and teachers and parents need to come together as an ecosystem. And you know, you'll be surprised that in spite of all the crisis that we have dipping allocations for resources domestically, and of course the cuts that have taken place. But it is important that even in complex topics of citizenship, menstrual hygiene management, SRHR, things like tolerance, diversity, conflict, that it was said, sorry, you cannot talk about conflict. But my parents fought. My father beat up my mother, or somebody killed somebody. You can't talk. There's a culture of silence. How do you bring the invisible into the visible? How do you bring the culture of silence into the open without feeling guilty all the time, and to be able to become therapists for each other? And how to empower the disempowered, or make the ordinary into the extraordinary has been the story of all our work. And more importantly, how to be able to document it, produce it as reports, show it to them. So we've had 4 iterations of Status of Teachers in Pakistan, many works that inform the government of the evidence. The result is today we still have a teacher shortage of almost, as I said, 1 million teachers. But today the government have managed, from those bleak days of 2000, to have more than 90% teachers in attendance, to begin to talk about, and COVID brought its own dividends, including the raising of the trust level. You are working from home, we trust you that you will be able to do it. Giving them Microsoft licenses to more than 400,000 teachers in Pakistan. Today in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, in Punjab, in many places, you're talking of hybrid teaching, and government is endorsing hybrid teaching. In fact, it's cut the cost down for training. I'm not saying always hybrid teaching or technology or online teaching is good, but that has meant that. But also it means that the government is hiring on higher qualification, more merit-based hiring, and acknowledging from time to time. Now, whether the politician is just going to do it because he or she takes so many other chores from the teachers, but I think it is important to have those public acknowledgements. Teachers today are in the center of the reform, but is that enough? Is that enough that I'm so glad we had this panel, because the debates on teachers, in spite of the UNESCO task forces, in spite of the work of LGI on workforce initiatives, etc., we are still short on what does the new teacher look like, who believes in the spirit of a positive spirit, that transformation is possible, that whether it is Camp Fed or whether what's happening in Rwanda, the longitudinal studies, what's happening in Ethiopia, that they need to be at the center of this conversation on policy, on reforms, not just top-down, and as we have worked from the bottom up to show what is possible on the ground, and then inform the people at the top. Those are the kind of iterative actions that we've done over the past 25 years. I believe change is happening. I believe like all of you, in a glass half full, even in these bleak times. I believe these aid cuts and also what's happening in the country will make many of us in our own countries rise up to the ground and stop saying, I don't understand finance. They jolly well need to understand finance and know how to take more money from within, and to be able to leverage that through a blended financing solution from outside. I think we'll come to a new homeostasis, a new equilibrium, and I think that's much needed for teachers as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that powerful speech there, Rona.
Thanks, Pauline. Good afternoon. My name is Rona Bronwin. I'm an education advisor with the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, FCDO, previously DFID. And it's a huge privilege to be here today, because for the last 7 years I've been working very closely with the Real Centre and partners across my different roles in research in Ethiopia, and then more recently in policy as foundational learning lead. So it's fantastic to be here. And I'm also particularly chuffed to be on this panel, because for the first half of my career I was a primary teacher in inner city London, and we were preoccupied on a day to day with a relentless and collective focus on equitable learning. So I hear you, Baela, in terms of that's what's needed, and that's where my interest is as well. So in answer to your question, Pauline, I'm going to touch on some achievements to start with, given we're here in the spirit of celebration, in terms of what's really made the difference in ensuring teachers support equitable learning. And I think to start with, we're going to focus on the growing research, or rigorous research, that we now have on teaching and learning in the Global South, and particularly, the long-term multidisciplinary research. And a lot of that is down to the Real Centre and the opportunities and the partnerships that have come through. And I'm thinking in particular about the Rise Ethiopia work that we've heard a lot about today. And I had the absolute privilege of working in Ethiopia at the time, supporting the government on their system reforms to improve equitable learning. And I was in a very unique position, which I did not take for granted at the time, that we had this fantastic research programme focusing on the impact on learning outcomes and on the most marginalised throughout that time. And we've heard a lot today from wonderful colleagues on all that they achieved. But it's not just the Rise Ethiopia. I mean, Pauline, you were our senior research fellow for a number of years in DFID, and you had an instrumental impact in really driving the buy-in to the power of education research, and particularly the long-term nature that is needed for that. And we've seen that across our subsequent programs, EdTech Hub, What Works Hub, and the real policy relevant focus of those programs as well. And I'm also reminded of the impact wheel that some of us will remember it here, that developed many years ago as part of the impact initiative. But again, that's had this ongoing life with the subsequent programs, Rise and What Works Hub, in terms of really ensuring that that research is answering the questions that policymakers have and responding to that need. So that leads me on to my second achievement, which I think is this shift over this period in really focusing on learning outcomes and on impact. And we know that teachers are central, quality teaching is the biggest difference in terms of improving learning. And we saw that in the Global Education Advisory Panel that came a report a few years ago, which looked at the evidence-based solutions, and the two most evidence-based solutions were around supporting teachers. So whether that was supporting them with curriculum and coaching and resources with the structured pedagogy approach, or looking at supporting teachers with targeted instruction. But I think here at the Real Centre, you've been really driving a very holistic vision of what we mean by learning outcomes and what we mean by impact. So I'm thinking about all the work you've done on the social emotional learning side, and we really benefited from that in Ethiopia. But also thinking about impact more broadly, and again thinking about the cost effectiveness work that you mentioned this morning, Julia, in partnership with CamFed, and the how much that's raised the awareness around what the impact of supporting the most marginalised looks like and can be. And that leads me to my third point around achievement, I think, is this relentless focus on the most marginalised, which we have seen progress in. I'm thinking of Lydie and her team and all the work on disability and teaching and learning, as well as we've discussed the girls' education side, and focusing on the poorest in so many of these contexts, as well as the conflict and crisis. So recently, I think the ERIC research programme that's supported by FCDO has produced an evidence review on teachers and teacher management in those contexts. Clearly we need a lot more in this area, and although we know good teaching is inclusive teaching and what works for most marginalised supports everybody, it doesn't just happen. You have to have this focus, otherwise they're left behind. So I think we're making progress, but a long way to go there still. And I guess that leads me to the challenges, which I won't labour because I think we all know them in this room, but maybe to start with the scale of the challenge, which Baela touched on. I mean, I think what's the figure that is used? 44 million more teachers are needed to achieve SDG 4. And so there are just not enough as we stand. We've also got the scale of the spending challenge, so there'll be more focus than ever on national government education budgets, and we know that 75% to 95% is spent on teacher salaries alone, but they're not getting the returns that they need on this if we look at the outcomes and the impact. And that seems to be deteriorating. You know, the estimated learning poverty is increasing over recent years due to the challenges that we've heard around COVID, an increase in conflict and crisis. So yes, the scale of the challenge is there, therefore the scale of solution needs to be there too. And that brings me finally to, I think, the other challenge which the other speakers have spoke fantastically on, around the need to support teachers in these in the context that they find themselves in, and in these difficult environments. And I mean, I think Dawit mentioned, even the very basic needs are not met. Teachers are, the pay is low, it's irregular. Even if we think, before we even think about the training, I think 40% of teachers in sub-Saharan Africa, primary teachers, are currently not trained. And then I think the final piece is the teacher voice piece, which has been a thread, I think, through, and Real Centre have been such a champion of. And I guess the challenge to all of us here is, how can we make sure that teacher voice is part of the conversation, so that we can ensure they are supported by the policy and programmes that are intended to drive equitable learning, but that in turn the policy and programmes and research that we are doing is strengthened by their voice, to make sure that we have equitable learning, which we are all collectively here working on today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.